We're good. So, welcome everyone. We're gonna get started with our, thank you, with our Budget Committee meeting. We have a few few committee members absent. Actually, Tyson Pruitt is not gonna be joining us today, but we do have Director Kylo and Rachel Dewey Thorsett, who said they'll be here a few minutes late, as well as Adriana. So we're gonna get started, but before that, we want to welcome our new Budget Committee member, Cynthia. If we want to say hi to everybody.
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So thank you, and I just want to remind everybody before we get started. To help me in my new duties, it will be really helpful if you raise your hands when you want to speak or ask a question. And also, since this is being broadcasted on CCTV, please remember to use your microphones whenever you're going to speak. The first item on the agenda for tonight, we're going to be reviewing the proposed 2019-2020 budget, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Superintendent Perry to guide us over that document.
All right, thank you. And before we begin, since we're in a little different format, I wanted to remind you this is Sarah Head, our Director of Finance, and I'd like her to introduce her staff because they're usually not this close to us. They're usually in the back of the room, and you don't notice them as much. So, Sarah, if you would introduce your staff quick.
Okay.
For us.
So here on the end, we have Tabitha Brewhart, and this is Christina Kiss, and Heather Latham, and Annalie Tymanow.
They are the analysts that are do the work behind all of the detail in this budget document, on top of keeping us fiscally accountable every single day. And they will be listening to your questions and looking some things up and taking notes for us so that hopefully we can better answer your questions on the spot tonight. So with that, I just wanted to make a couple comments before we open it up for a question and answer session. So currently we are kind of truing up the end of the biennium with Oregon Department of Education. And what that means is, for those of you new to this, is that we get lookbacks to previous years, and we also get some new revenue estimates for this current year. So I know you think we've closed out our year, but we always have this revenue that either comes in May or leaves us in May. So sometimes in May you can get what we call a negative May adjustment, which means they ask you for money back. And sometimes you can get a positive May adjustment. We generally try to be positive, but every once in a while something catches you in that. But as we're looking at this year's truing up process for the biennium, we do see an upward trend in our revenue. We're not quite ready to say how much that is yet because we do not have all of the documents from ODE. We still get estimates from them kind of on a daily basis. But we are trending positively, which is good news for this proposed budget. And what I'd like to do next week on May 7th is bring to you a revision to the proposed budget. And in that revision will be, and I wouldn't say this if I didn't feel good about this fiscally, but will be up to 6 additional guidance counselors. One for each high school. We've talked a lot about the social emotional needs of our students, especially at high school, and those guidance counseling positions are the first line of defense for our students, especially at high school. So my goal would be to bring up to 6 and bring those back in a budget revision, which will bring back a budget revision in the revenue side as well. So we'll try to bring that all back to you, but I wanted to be sure you knew that, and I think that's high on the minds of our counselors across the district. The other thing I want to make a note of is that we found a technical error in the budget this week that I said in my budget message there are 7.0 social workers and 6, one for each high school feeder area, and then 1 on suicide prevention. We had a limited term position that we didn't get rolled up into the this proposed budget. So this proposed budget actually only has 6. And I'll bring back some sort of a recommendation on that next week. Marty, question?
Yeah, I have a question on the additional counselors. So 6 of them, so that's north, south, McKay, McNary, West, and Sprague. So nothing for Roberts or early college?
Not right at this time, but I'm just trying to signal that I have 6 that we're looking at, and we'll make those decisions for next week. So I'll also make a decision around the social worker before next week. And even before next Tuesday, when I bring back a revision to you, I do want to release some of that counseling FTE, because what we know is that early hiring is essential for our recruitment. So if I can go ahead and release it, which I will make that decision tomorrow, then at least our schools can begin the hiring process. Nothing will happen before next Tuesday night anyway, as far as hiring. So that is kind of where I'm going to show you the changes. Then I want to walk you through in your budget book just a couple places so you know where those are. So if you go to page 71, and the top of page 71 is 2120 guidance services and 111 regular licensed. This is where you will see any increases in counselors next week. If you look right on the page before, on page 70, attendance and social work, 2110, this is where the social workers are budgeted, just as a reminder.
So you said the next page?
70, sorry, I was working from 71 to 70.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I went backwards. And then finally, I would also like you to look at page 72, because this was a bit of a change from last year, and I just want to show you where it is and why I did it in this way. So under 2130 health services, 112 regular classified. Remember last year we had lots of testimony around the school-based health assistants at the elementary school, and we put in a pool of money for that. What we have done with that is rolled that up into FTE instead of a pool of money. And that is important, because when it's rolled up in FTE, that means when there's increased costs, those get added, versus having a pool of money that buys less people year after year as your costs escalate. So we've rolled those into FTE, same concept as last year, but in the actual FTE count. So you'll see an increase in FTE counts in the school-based health assistants. So in the other, unrelated to the budget document that's come up over the course of the week, the question came around from Levy around how do you do stakeholder engagement around a proposed budget ahead of the budget process? And I wanted to answer that in 2 ways. One is you can't actually do stakeholder engagement outside of the budget process related to the entire proposed budget, because that's the point in time we are now. You get it first, then you get community engagement. But there's a couple places that if you think about it, last year we heard a lot about those bilingual assistants at the elementary level, and we had reduced those last year. And this year, we have declining English learners at our elementary schools to the rate of, if we applied the same formula, we would reduce bilingual assistants at the elementary by about 10 FTE. But based on that, what we heard from our stakeholders last year, we chose to hang on to that. Even though our EL numbers, our English learner numbers are declining at elementary, we left that 10 FTE bilingual assistance because we really heard the importance of that connection with our communities of students that are learning English. So I just wanted to kind of come back to that question a little bit. All right, so here's how the process is going to work. I'm going to give it back to the chair to open up for questions. If there's a question that we can answer, Sarah, Mike, or I, with the help of other executive admin at the end of the table. We're going to try to answer those on the spot for you. At the same time, we are going to be having both executive admin and our analysts typing questions that we can't answer, because there's a number of questions that within a few minutes of our work, we could answer for you. So we'll get as many questions answered as we can right now. Then we're going to take a break. We'll see if there's a few more questions we can tackle. And then we will come back to the questions that might actually take us longer to answer because they take more research. And I'll ask our chair and vice chair to put that through the process. And the process is there sufficient committee interest, and is the information needed to approve the budget? So, all right, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. So we'll get started with Marty, since you sent a question earlier, and then again, just remember to raise your hands.
So I have 2.5 questions.
Okay.
2 of them are kind of related. And if it's more appropriate to ask these and when we're having a regular board meeting, please let me know,
Okay.
and I will do so then. The first one is, we're looking at the high-level numbers here, and I have people being curious about what kind of discretionary spending a principal might have. I mean, obviously, they're not paying payroll, right? It's the district. And so that is part A of the first question. And the other is, why would replacing a broken piece of equipment then become the something that the principal would deal with versus the district? That's the first question. You want the
Okay.
second one?
Would you like to?
Yeah, why don't I take the first part one of the 2-part question.
Okay.
So let's take what sort of discretionary funds are available to a principal. So we do, you're right, they don't pay for payroll. Even our technology purchasing is centralized. But they do get an amount per student in their school. So that purchases the paper, the art supplies, some of the printing, all of that. So for an elementary school, it's 137 plus in some sense dollars per student. Middle school is around 189 dollars per student, and then high school is $211 per student. The second part, not quite a budget question, but I think I can easily answer it, is, so that's the discretionary funds. We do require principals to be thinking strategically about how can you use those discretionary funds for maintenance, equipment, all of those things. If they don't have it within there, there's a facility use process for requesting maintenance items.
Okay,
Anything
thank
to
you.
add to that, Mike?
No.
Okay.
So that was the first question, basically. And then the second question that I've been asked by some people in the public is, how much money have we spent so far on busing for OSAA over the Cascades? So not only for the amount of travel, but how much has this cost us in staff overtime or, additional expenses that normally would not have been incurred had we stayed within the original boundaries that we were at before?
I also had that question, and where to find it, if it is in here.
So let me show you where it is budgeted first. So that would be the first part of the question. If you look at page 59, function 1132. Say that again. 60. Oh, I'm sorry. One more page, 60. It was highlighted on the next page. 330, so it's going to be at the top of the next page. Field and activity trips. You'll see in this proposed budget is $657,000. That's where the transportation costs for field trips are. Now, that is not every trip over the pass. That is all of the high school field trip and activity trips. A portion of that is an incurred cost is around, we have some additional athletic trainer services that are needed. So those are in 310. So our contract for our athletic trainers has increased because of increased travel. So about 50,000 increased in 310, and then that $425,000 increase in transportation. And we've rolled forward a similar budget in the proposed budget for those costs. So the second part of your question is, what does it actually cost just for the bend portion? What are the increases? And that would be a tough question to answer. What I can ask Sarah, do we have field and activity trips to date expenditures in that one item, or do we not have that?
So we have exceeded last year already this year by a small amount, and we still have sports going on.
Yeah. So the high-level answers, we've exceeded last year's spending by a small amount, and we are about 3 weeks from being finished with spring sports.
Other questions? Paul?
Yes, I'm assuming for example, on page 5, the table will be updated since Adam is no longer with us.
Oh, yes.
Just
Yep.
questioning that. And then on page 14, I have a question. It appears we have an extra administrator there, and I'm always glad to see Jim Orth here, and I'm glad to see Craig, but I'd like to know how we're dealing with how that pay all worked out,
Yeah.
where that's in the budget. And you want me to keep going, or you want to?
How about if I take that one first? So for the org chart, there aren't final decisions about the org chart for next year, so I put in the current organizational chart. But what I'll tell you is in the proposed budget, in the adopted budget from last year, and in the proposed budget for this next year, we have the same number of administrative FTE in there, especially in your pointing out exec admin. So in supervisory licensed and supervisory classified, we have a superintendent, assistant superintendent, director of academic achievement, chief operations officer, HR director. And for this year, remember, we left the CTE position vacant. So those are all rolled forward in the same way. In the proposed budget. And we'll update the organizational chart when there's changes to that.
Would we update the other table?
Yep.
Okay. And then on page 19, I was just curious how the student ratios were determined. Was that every adult in the building to the students? Was that only classroom teachers? Was that classroom teachers and specialists? Was it classroom teachers, specialists, and administrators? How did you come up with these ratios?
This is the actual, especially at elementary, this is the classroom teacher allocation.
Okay, that's what I wanted to check, classroom teacher only.
Middle and high, there's a couple additional positions included in the allocation. It's not ever the administrators, though.
Okay.
And I don't actually have the full one on that.
Okay. On page 54, I want to make sure, this is probably more of my question. The beginning fund balance for this for last year was budgeted at $46 million. So it's like 5,400, is that correct?
So I'm sorry, your
Page
question is?
54.
Yep.
5,400, last year we budgeted 46 million.
Yes.
Okay, as I understand budgets, if I look on page 100, line 770, the unreserved fund balance, that would have become the beginning fund balance for this year,
Sorry, where's that, Paul?
page 100. So that should have been, so the line 770, the 51 million, would have become the 46 million actual back on page 54. So what happened to the $5 million between the 46 and the 51? Well, that might take a little more time,
Yeah.
but I'm just curious as to where that 5 million went.
Right. No, we understand the question. I think there's a broader question or an answer that comes back next week that talks about that and the revenue that we're projecting that Superintendent Perry talked about earlier.
Mike, would you be able to explain what the beginning fund balance, at least the
Yeah.
concept is? I know this is something that always gets us new committee members.
Yeah. So when we talk about resource, so there's revenue, but there's. am I
Sure,
on?
you're on, you just gotta be a little closer.
Okay. Am I on?
Yep.
Okay. All right, I'll lean forward. So we talk about revenue, right? From the state school fund, you can see the sources of the revenue that comes in. But when we're also, in the budget context, we're talking about resources. So total resources would include everything that we haven't spent, right? So when you look at what the actual ending fund balance is, basically, as Director Kylo mentioned on page 100, that may or may not be the number that rolls forward in the budget. Because typically what we want to do, and we can get into this in more detail next week, typically what we want to do is make sure that we're budgeting conservatively, and everything that we put in the budget, right, as far as resources, we allocate. So it's allocated throughout all of the line items, throughout all the functions and all the objects. And then what rolls up, anything that isn't allocated would be, in the general fund, would be the contingency fund. And so we can trace those dollars for you, and we'll come back next week with maybe a brief presentation or work paper on that.
Jesse, and just remember, use your microphones, please.
And can I just add one thing to Mike's comment? On page 100 in 17-18, the $51 million is the actual ending fund balance. So that gets put in this budget document once the auditors have finished their work, which is about October, November, December. I'm looking at Sarah. So when we do a proposed budget, the proposed beginning fund balance, it actually is just an estimate. So last year we proposed that the beginning fund balance would be at 46, but when we tied out the end of the year and our auditors tied it out, we actually ended from the previous year, 17-18, at $51 million.
Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify, so in a perfect world, we would have the line on 770 match the line on 5400. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you could ever,
If it was.
if you could ever live in a perfect world, yes.
Okay. Okay, good.
If you did that, I would also, though, recommend that you come in with a higher contingency.
Yeah.
So there would be other ways, if you could totally nail down that number, you would want to adjust other places like your contingency to not have all of it be spent.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to
Yep.
clarify the relationship.
Yep.
Well, and since we're on it, one more thing. Remember, the 17-18 is an actual. We won't have the actual in this year, 18-19, until December 31st, but yet we're having the conversation about 19-20 now.
Yep.
So it really is a series of estimates that lag a year.
That makes sense.
Question?
Other questions? Kathleen?
Chrissy, I was very happy to hear that you plan to use any additional funds to fully fund 6 FTEs for guidance counseling at the high school. What are the current guidance counselor staffing at Roberts and early college?
I am going to have to put that one on the list. I might have a sheet with it on it, but I'm not finding it right
Okay.
this minute.
And then I wanted to look back and see with the increase in the school-based health assistance, what have we had feedback from parents, students, staff, how that is helping or not? I always like when we're making change in funding, like to look back and see if it's had the desired consequences or not.
Okay, I'll put that one on the list
Okay.
because I don't have that one with me.
And I know you have mentioned in here several of your wish list items that if the monies come through from the legislature, which it appears they may, I'd like to know kind of like a priority of those, of that list. And it wasn't clear to me if that was listed as you have it in a priority or not, but I think that would be really helpful to see where you'd like to spend those monies.
So I'm gonna make sure those are getting on the list, okay?
Alrighty, I just got a few of them. So the first is, what is the total cost of the Office of Behavioral Learning? Like, how much are we spending on that? And then with that, where are other places that we fund things that are helpful for kids in terms of social emotional health in the budget?
All right, so I believe Sarah has the full OBL number, and I'm going to say it. Linda was going to be prepared for this question, and she's stuck in traffic on the freeway. So it is the total expenditures just in the Office of Behavioral Learning is about $6.1 million. $6.3 million. That includes some psychologists, that includes self-contained programs for behavior in special education, that includes the social workers, that includes what we call the embedded cadre, that includes our PBIS trainers. So there's a lot included in that Office of Behavioral Learning. Some of that actually, especially with the behavior cadre, is allocated directly out to schools. So that is $6.3 million. And then I think if I can get to the right page, I have some marks in here.
Christy, while you're looking that up,
Yep.
does that include dedicated federal funds? That's 6.1.
Yes. Yes. Give an example. Say that one more time.
IDEA funds.
No, that's just the general fund.
That's just general funds, so that's not federal dollars that also flow to supplement those services.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Some of, yeah, that is correct. I'm going to give you a page number for where I put all those nice notes on.
I think you wanted to go through the functions.
Yep.
Did you want to go through like psych and anything?
Yeah, anything that might be, let's hold that one till right after break, because Linda's prepped for it too. So, and I'll look it up. Do you have another one, Jesse?
Oh, yes. I had another one which was, I lost my fuzzy. That sucks. Alrighty, how is nutrition program funded? So when we're talking about like school lunches, breakfasts, that sort of thing.
So the school lunch program is actually not in the general fund. So it is in special revenue fund, 200. And the actual food service fund starts on page 131.
Hey, Linda.
We were just talking about you, Linda Myers.
Right.
So 131 starts the food service program, and you'll see at the top of the food service program is your resources. So this is how we get our money. Legally, you are required to do your food service program, and it should be a cost neutral program to the general fund out of a separate revenue fund. So we get about $21 million in revenue into the food service fund. And you can see it comes not only in how kids pay for school lunches, the daily sales non-reimbursable is how kids pay, but also we get reimbursed for quite a bit in our school lunch program. So we get about $14 million from the federal school lunch. We also get $213,000 from the state school breakfast program, and then $180,000 from the state school fund lunch match program. There is quite a bit of talk at the legislative level around universal meals for kids in high poverty schools, and that's in that Student Success Act. So if that passed, there should be more dollars coming into this fund in order to feed more kids at no cost. Then the requirements are where we pay for staff and our contracted services and our food and all of that within this fund. So this is Fund 200 outside of the general fund, but this was where everything related to school lunches happens in the budget book.
Okay,
Did
thank
did
you.
you have a follow-up on that? Kathy was ahead of you, but just want to make sure.
Quick one. So universal meals means feeding every kid at the school without regard to signing up for lunch program?
There is a change to that, however, in the legislation that's coming out of the Student Success Act. Due to the way in which federal reimbursement dollars work, they couldn't fully fund universal meals out of state dollars. The idea is to get any kid who wants or needs a meal, to have them get a meal out of these dollars, but they're not calling it universal meals anymore because that caused some federal problems, Rachel, with the way we get reimbursements from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But any student, the idea is to fund any student who wants or needs a meal, the district would be reimbursed for those costs, so that we don't put our federal dollars for the state of Oregon at risk.
So it was partly by the state and partly by the federal
Correct,
dollars.
correct.
And that $14 million there is what's at risk, just
Yeah.
in one big school district. Other big school districts like us have that same risk. Yep.
Thank you. Kathy?
One quick thing on what we're just talking about on student success. That passed in the House, is it passed in the Senate yet?
It hasn't passed the House yet. It's due to be voted on the House floor tomorrow, Kathy. They plan to have it on the Senate next week and then to the governor. So we can't count that money yet. We got a couple of steps to get through yet.
Yeah,
so.
okay, well, thank you. Also, on my questions, I want to go clear back to page, I lost it, I think it's page 31. And the increase marked here in associated payroll costs is PERS plus what? Because it's about a $19 million there. And earlier, we had cost of PERS at 14 for an increase.
Sarah, do you have the answer to that question?
So 14 is Gen Fund.
Microphone.
Is it working?
You just have to get close.
14 is the Gen Fund, and then page 31 is all funds combined.
Okay,
And what else is included in that associated payroll cost beyond PERS?
So Social Security, Medicare,
the 6%.
yeah, the 6%, and our workers' comp rates.
Okay, are all those same things
Insurance.
included? Are all those same things included in the 14 as well? That's earlier, that is not all funds.
The 14 was solely PERS. And when we say APC, we're including PERS, insurance, all the taxes, everything.
Okay.
And there is a page in the book, we'll have to find the page number, that actually just only shows PERS, that I referred to in the budget message. And we'll find
I
that.
thought that was the one that said 14. It was something earlier than
was.
when I was going through it. But
So on
I'll
page,
find it.
yeah, on page 98.
What was that page again?
98. So this is by object code, so it's broken out a little different than by function. And if you look clear to the associated payroll costs, you have 210, Public Employees Retirement System.
yeah,
1819 was at 71, 1920 is at 85. So there's that 14 million just in the PERS costs that I referred to in the budget message.
okay.
Just to clarify, is this the full PERS cost right there? Or is it anywhere else?
This is the full PERS cost for the general fund, and it includes dollars that go directly to PERS and also dollars that help service our debt. Marty, still a PERS question?
Yes.
Yeah.
But isn't there also a part that we're paying back? Didn't we get a loan or something
Yeah.
at one
Service.
point?
That's the bond service fund she was just talking about.
All right,
179.
okay.
Yeah, so this number is what it costs us for PERS. I think the number's about 9% that we put towards servicing our debt because the board, previous boards refinanced our unfunded actuarial liability. And so that 9% goes into the PERS debt service, which is on page 179, and pays our principal and interest payment for the, technically the loan.
Oh,
Did I miss anything on that,
Very
Sarah?
bottom.
Okay. But the total cost to this year's budget is on page 98.
Thank you. And I want to pause real quick. I just welcome everyone who's joined us since we started. And also, I did receive a message from committee member Adriana, who's at the legislature. She's not able to join us. She did send a few questions, so I want to ask one of her questions for her is, how does the Salem-Keizer School District compare to state average in spending? Is it possible to look at a breakdown of instruction time, student supports, administration, et cetera, of how the district spends its monies in comparison to state averages? Any of that you can?
Yeah, okay, and I think that I'm gonna have us write down the question. Did you guys get that question?
So how does the district spending compare to state averages in spending in different categories?
Yeah, and I can forward this to you.
Okay,
That'd be great, thank you.
yeah, that would be great. And that one, I think we can pull that either through the Forecast 5 stuff or through, it used to have a thing called, so that will have to be a get back to you question. And we couldn't do it for sure on the proposed budget, but we might be able to look like at 18, 19. We'll think about that one. Thank you.
And thank you, Liz, for handing out a copy of that message. Kathy?
yeah, I had one more that I hadn't finished on, and it's not as broad as the others. But can I find in this how we outfitted the new science labs? And have we purchased that ongoing, or have we purchased it all up front? And do we use text in that as well as the equipment?
In the science labs? Are you
That we're
talking?
going through in the bond.
Oh, got it. Okay.
We're building them, we better have something to put in them.
Well, yes, we better. And that's part of the furniture, fixtures, and equipment, FF&E, that's associated with every classroom in the bond.
Okay,
And so we're in process on that.
okay. Are we gonna have text use, or have we determined what we're gonna use in science instruction?
I'm not sure I'm tracking, but Linda looks like she knows.
Is this on?
It's
Oh,
on,
it is
yeah.
on. So we are not in the process of purchasing new science materials, so things that are currently in place in our middle school and high school classrooms will roll up curriculum and instructional materials, lab-based materials, but it's not a rotation year for new curriculum in science.
Okay, thank you.
Could you help me understand the special education budget? I see on page 61 that's some of the staffing. I'm not sure if that's all of it. And then also what supports in the central office here for teachers and training.
Yeah, so I can tell you where we have the special education allocation or budgeted. And so let me answer that one first. If you start on page 102 in your budget book, I'm going by, so 102, 1220, restrictive programs for students with disabilities. There's both regular licensed and classified in there. The next one is just right under that, is 1250, less restrictive programs for students with disabilities. 1260 is the next one, treatment and habilitation programs. And then we go to 2120, there's some special education in the guidance services. Well, here's the thing, that is budgeted under student services, so we call it a special ed, but it's really our guidance counselors. 2130 is health services. This is where our nurses are, our school-based health assistants are. And again, that's under student services budget. So that's why I'm calling it a special education. They don't serve only students with disabilities. 2140, psychological services is also in part under special education. And I'm on the top of 104 right now. $21.50, speech, pathology, and audiology services. $21.60, other treatment services. And then $21.90, service direction, student support services. And then finally on 105, on 2550, we have student transportation services because we do have specialized transportation for a number of our students with disabilities. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. The second part of your question is there a place we budget for our central student services? And I'm going to have us put that one on the list to see if we can answer that one after a break.
Okay, thank you.
It's just, I don't think it's quite broken out that way.
Kathy, or?
Well,
Oh,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry.
Keep going.
Let me get Rachel.
This is a follow-up to Cynthia's question. So how, I probably knew this last year, but
okay.
how does what's in here covering special ed, does that include federal IDEA funds? Or are they, is there a separate page somewhere for everything that?
Yeah, there is a separate page. IDEA is in Special Revenue Fund 200 on page 141.
So what's on page 104 and 105 is just the state school funded portion of special ed, and then the IDEA funded portion of special ed is
Separate.
in the special.
Yep.
funds. Okay.
And for new budget committee members, we have a federal requirement that we spend, the simple way to think of it is the same amount in the general fund or more year after year. So you couldn't say as a budget committee, take out $10 million out of general fund special education services. Not that you would, but you couldn't say that to us because then we would not be meeting what's called maintenance of effort. So every year we have to spend as much or more in the general fund on special education services in order to receive our IDEA services. So that's called maintaining our effort or maintenance of effort.
Thank you. So I'll go to Kathleen and then Kathy.
Okay, so I may not be understanding this completely,
Yeah.
so help me out here. So I'm looking at PERS again, and I apologize. But, so looking at the PERS payroll cost on page 98, so we're going from a budget of 71.2, 18-19 to 85.7, so $14.5 million increase, correct?
Correct.
And part of that funding is coming from our reserves, that the difference that we have in our reserves is going towards paying that increase in cost? That data that's on page 179?
Say the second page number again.
179?
179.
The PERS reserve
Yeah,
at the
the
bottom?
PERS reserve fund. Yeah, So yes, part of this 85 million, 9% of payroll costs go into the PERS reserve fund.
Okay.
And the PERS reserve fund pays the debt, the principal and interest payment. The rest of the dollars in this fund go to PERS to pay for our PERS costs, our current PERS costs.
So I think I get that. So then the question I have is, in anticipating this continued explosion in the PERS cost in years to come, do we have, I know we've been fiscally very prudent in putting reserve funds out there and trying to manage these in other ways. Do we have a plan that for this year, how we're going to handle the cost for next year?
Yeah, so
biennium.
the costs are set for the biennium. So these costs will be similar percentages for the biennium. And it's a really good question. What you should be watching is actually on page 181. So if you look at page 181, this is our annual interest and principal payments for each of our debts, because we've gone out 3 times, 4 times. And what you'll see is that debt service cost also escalate, which is why you don't want to take every bit of the $49 million in the proposed reserve fund and put it into other places. You need to plan for that escalating costs. So we've done a really pretty good job of that. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it continues to rise. Our annual principal and interest payment continues to rise for about 7 years. Is that the right number?
I think even a little more.
I'll leave a little more, so 9?
9 years.
And so for 9 years, that principal and interest payment will continue to rise, and then it will begin to drop off. So we should be watching that PERS debt service. In the past, we have put a transfer into the PERS debt service of about $6 million. If we come out with a really positive May adjustment, that may actually be something we ask you to consider, because even you can put in $1 million or $2 million, that just helps that fund.
So the budget as it stands does not have that included,
No,
correct?
as it stands, it
Okay,
does not.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Where do I find,
Go ahead.
where do I find what's in the PERS reserve fund right now?
Page 179.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I had another one too. Oh, and this one has to do with, I called it the pull-out discipline, and that's the wrong name. But I can't come up with the one where the majority of the class leaves and we leave one student in when it's a disciplinary
Room
problem.
clear.
Room clear?
Room clear, there it is.
There you go.
So who handles the room clear? The teacher leaves with the majority, and is the principal called in to do the room clear?
Principal, a behavior specialist, an embedded behavior cadre member, an instructional mentor, a school counselor, anybody who happens to be available at that time.
Okay,
But one of those highly trained people.
okay. So that isn't just our school counselor, or it may be?
It could be. Yeah, it could be. It could be the principal, an assistant principal, a school counselor, behavior specialist, or also those embedded behavior cadre from the Office of Behavioral Learning.
Okay, will we have more funds for that program? And I don't know where
Yeah.
that program is in our budget either.
So when we're ready, we can switch, if Linda's ready, to talk about where we fund Office of Behavioral Learning, but also any other positions in the budget that might not be under the Office of Behavioral Learning, so behavior specialists, guidance counselors, all that. You ready?
Yeah, are you ready?
So this is Jesse's question, and kind of is going to hit on Kathy's question a little bit.
So expenditures related to the Office of Behavioral Learning are interspersed in multiple places, and so I can kind of walk you through. Just to give you some frame of reference, there's about $6.3 million included in this budget that funds the Office of Behavioral Learning. And a little bit less than half of that is general education supports, and then a portion of that is directed towards our students with disabilities, which then is included in that concept of maintenance of effort. So that's included in those dollars that we have to spend on an annual basis. So I can give you, I've got specific functions and page numbers if you want those, but one of the things I want to remind you, so for instance, OBL expenses are included in function 1111, which is on page 55. But as you look under elementary instruction, you're not going to see OBL expenses called out in there. There are licensed staff or classified staff that are embedded in elementary instruction. So you need to remember that not everything in elementary instruction is OBL, and both ways are true. So there isn't a place in here where OBL is everything in elementary instruction, and elementary instruction doesn't include everything from OBL.
Okay, I missed that page
That was
number,
very
I'm
confusing.
sorry.
No, I understood.
Page 55, page 55.
Thank you, Marty, for the support. 55?
55.
Thank you.
So that's elementary instruction. There are additional portions of OBL in 1220, which is page 61. Those are components of the Office of Behavioral Learning that specifically relate to students with disabilities. So 1220 is restrictive programs for students with disabilities. So we have specialized classrooms, specially trained employees. Those are funded in that 1220 function. But again, not all of OBL is in 1220, and not all of 1220 is OBL. So you'll see that over and over again. 2110, page 70, that's attendance and social work. As the name implies, that's where all of our social workers, that FTE all sits in that fund. And I don't believe we have specific attendance work associated with OBL, but the attendance work that's occurring specifically in our middle schools with some staff is in that fund as well.
Can I ask a question on that? So on 2110 and 2100, the total funding, the dip, the rise in the dip, 9 million, 10 million, 5 million, 5 million. But
In
yet the
2110,
yeah, but yet the staffing,
where are you seeing 9 million, 5 million?
page 70, is that where you're at? 21?
Yep.
Yeah, so at the bottom, total attendance and social work
Sure.
services.
So let's talk about the big, what appears to be a big decrease from 27-18 to 2018-19. That simply was a movement of FTE within the budget. So behavior specialists who serve at the individual school level used to be represented. You'll see that there used to be 71.75 FTE in that fund. Behavior specialists were moved out of that fund, basically moved from the instruction side of the budget to support. So that's what that,
was last year.
and that was from 17-18 moving into 18-19, correct. All right, yeah, no problem. So then we move to 2140, which is page 73, psychological services, mental health supports, testing that may need to occur to determine eligibility for students in need of behavioral supports. Psychological mental health services are in 2140. 2190 on page 75. You'll note specifically that in 2190, you'll see supervisory licensed staff. This is where our administrator for the Office of Behavior, the OBL, and so regular classified staff sit in service direction and supervisory licensed staff. So that's student support services. There are administrators for OBL. There's a administrator for OBL, as well as administrators that serve within student services, all in that account together.
So, and Cynthia, that comes back to your question about where some of the district level special education personnel, and that's one of the places.
Yeah. And then finally, we have OBL expenses in 2240, which is instructional staff development. That is page 80. And those expenses in PD are specifically aligned to the proactive work that we're doing with PBIS and trainings and coachings that go along with that under the umbrella of OBL.
Jesse?
So PBIS is included with the Office of Behavioral Learning?
Correct.
Okay.
PBIS initiative lives in the Office of Behavioral Learning.
Okay. Makes sense.
And remember, it's, there's support for it at the district level, but the true work happens out in the schools with behavior specialists, counselors, principals, teacher teams.
Clarification about OBL.
Question on that, it's something else.
Go ahead. Or the, Chuck, question?
Linda, if you look at this year's, or the proposed budget in this category compared to last year's, and you add all those numbers together that you've been talking about, what's the comparison between last year and this year?
You know what? I don't have that dollar figure off the top of my head, although we do have some increases in FTE, and we certainly could calculate the difference. For instance, we've increased the number of social workers that we have from 17-18 into this current year, 18-19, and those have been retained into 19-20. We've increased the number of behavior cadre. I'd have to look at the specific FTE. We actually could check that on the FTE comparison list, but if you want a flat $6.5 million, 6.3 million, sorry, I wanted to do 6.3 million in OBL this year compared to what was it in 18-19, we can get that number for you.
I'd appreciate that,
Okay.
yeah.
Jim?
So this is not related to OBL, this is on page 81. Code 2310, Board of Education Services, specifically account number 380, the non-instructional, professional, and technical services. I'm assuming that's our legal and audit fees? Because those are charged
yeah.
to the board.
To the board, that is correct.
That's the legal and audit fee.
Correct. Is the audit fee in there
Because
as
I was
well?
like, I didn't
Yeah.
get any technical services.
You sure got a lot.
Any other questions?
Can I ask? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is kind of a follow-up to the special education question. Where do positions exist that specifically help teachers with modified curriculum for kids that are in gen ed classes? And where do those exist?
Okay, I don't know if I have quite the answer, but I'm going to put it on our list.
Okay.
To see.
PAs, special education PAs, not sure where they
Yeah,
are.
and I just don't know quite where they are in
Yeah.
the budget. I think we can get that on a break.
I just have two, on page 100 again, item 810, operating contingencies. The actual in 2016, 17, and 17, 18 was 0. That seems odd to me, but if that's what it was, then that's my.
Yeah, I think what we did previously is we budgeted it as a unreserved fund balance.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to let you answer it, Sarah.
So the budget law format is those first two columns on the left are actuals. So when you have your actuals for the year, you just have your ending fund balance. You don't have a contingency in your actuals.
Okay.
So that's why it shows as 0.
That's fine, I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
Yeah.
And then as always, I'm impressed with all of the staff data, the personnel statistics, and everybody's salary, and I can almost find people except one person. The superintendent isn't listed in there, so if we could just get that somewhere, that would be helpful too.
Do you get paid?
Yeah. Yeah. I will tell you, it is budgeted in that executive admin,
Page 81.
yeah, page,
Yeah,
under 2320.
I know,
Yep.
I understand, but
Yep.
when I see everybody else's and I can find individuals,
Yeah, you'd like mine in there
it seems a
too.
bit odd that I can't find the one person at the top.
So we'll take a couple more questions before taking a break, so we
Okay.
can get those questions. So Sharon, and then Virginia.
Okay. Page 118, total high school extracurricular, an increase of about 2 million over the last couple of years. You just, I'm not sure who I'm looking at, clarify what falls under extracurricular and the increase, please.
I'm looking at Sarah to see if she has an answer, yeah.
Okay, so on page 118, we're in the fee-based fund, so this would be ASBs
Okay.
and other programs.
Got it.
And part of it is we have to leave room to record donations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but I'll ask it. Okay, so we have curriculum that we use to teach kids about why they should not smoke or the dangers of smoking, et cetera. We've been talking about this at our PTC meetings, that they seem a little outdated at this point in time with the legalization of marijuana. And, sorry, now you're laughing. And then prescription drugs really being on top of mind for everybody. And I was wondering, when was the last time we got updated material that we're teaching from, and where would that be in the budget?
So the second question is, there isn't an updated curriculum adoption in the budget.
Okay.
So that's the second part of the question. I'd have to go back and find out when the last time we did, but we can put that on our list of questions.
Thank you.
Last one.
Alrighty, and I just wanted to ask this just because as we're talking about the budget, I think it's a really important conversation to have. When we're talking about the behavioral learning and social emotional needs of kids, I love hearing that we're getting new counselors, so thank you for talking about that and pushing the envelope on that. I think that's awesome, so thank you. But I would like to hear, because for us, when we're talking about numbers, we're around this 24/7. Parents at home or someone who might be seeing this or wanting to know about it wouldn't understand the lingo as much. And so what I'd like to know is just in layman's terms of like, when we're in a classroom, how will these new counselors make an impact? Like what impact are the changes of between last budget and this budget different, and what impact is it gonna make?
So with the addition of 6, the impact is at comprehensive high schools, so our large high schools. And what it does is it reduces the counselor to student ratio. So our counselors are tasked with not only the kind of some of the social emotional needs of our kids, suicide risk assessments, scheduling, college and career guidance counseling. And right now, our average at high school is 450 students to 1 counselor. So 6 would reduce that counselor ratio at all of our high schools, which would mean if a student, counselors would have more time to do things like suicide risk assessments and college and career counseling, because they'd have fewer students on their caseload.
Do we feel like that's a proficient amount?
No, I think the National Counseling Association guidance is 250 to 1 at high schools. I don't think I quite have the number at elementary and middle, but it's much less than what we have. The middle school ratio is projected at 412 to 1. So we're at 405 to 1 right now, and it's for counselors at the middle school, it's projected to be at 412 to 1 counselor at our middle schools. And no, those aren't enough.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a break to give staff time to look over the list of questions, and I'll ask you to include Adriana's on that. How much time do you feel?
Can you give us 10 minutes? There's a number that we won't be able to answer tonight anyway, and so we'll have to go through the question process. Do we want to get those on the list for next week? And so let's give us about 10 or 15 minutes to go through and see how close we are. So 7:15? 7:20? Okay. 7:15, Levy says. All right.
So now that the staff had a few minutes to look over our questions, hopefully we can get some of those harder questions answered, and hopefully we'll be out of here on time. Yeah.
Not as many as we were hoping, but let me go for that. So first of all, I do want to bring forward a question that Tyson asked, because I do have the answer for that. His main question was related to the dollars budgeted to the strategy to encourage our current minority students to become teachers. How much are we putting to that line item? And if finding quality candidates is difficult, this seems like an important long-term strategy. So the answer is our Grow Your Own programs, which aren't only for students, but are also for existing classified staff or licensed staff to administrators, are funded on page 93 in function 2690, object 374. So those are on 93. And we fund $360,000 in those Grow Your Own programs, which has been a strategy for us for a number of years. And then in addition, and this is not going to show up in a line item exactly in the budget, but it's within our current FTE. In our secondary schools, we take a 0.5 at North and a 0.5 licensed educator at McKay for a class of students that are interested in becoming educators. So we do have classes at North and McKay around that initiative. It just isn't in a dollar amount. It's within our large FTE number.
Before we go on, I just want to remind everybody to use their microphones when they speak because of TV, but also we have an interpreter helping our Spanish-speaking parents tonight, Jacqueline, so I want to thank her for her support, but it would be really helpful if we speak clearly and into the mic for her to translate.
All right, so the other question was around...
sorry, Jesse had a
Oh, I'm sorry.
question that
Oh, yeah, I was just missed, what was the line number on the first part of that?
It was line item function 2690, object 374 on page 93.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Find 374 either.
So that other tuition, and you see the actual $360,000 amount there.
Yep, 360.
Yep. The next question was around how many guidance counselors do we have at Early College, High School, and Roberts? We have 2 guidance counselors at Early College, High School, and these are all within the guidance counselor FTE. We have 2.35 counselors at Roberts High School, and in the proposed budget, I talked about a 0.35. That rolled into Roberts to round out some FTE for us there in guidance counselors. So those are the current numbers, all rolled up into that big guidance counselor number. Okay, go ahead.
And I'm assuming the ratios at those schools?
I would have to get you the ratios at those schools. I'm looking, Jim.
It's much lower than traditional high schools.
Yep. Do you know how many students we have at Early College High School?
Tell you.
We'll look that up, but it is much lower than the 400 and some to another. Yes.
It's about approximately 60 students per grade year, so, 200,
Yeah.
I can do math, 460 or whatever it is. I know, so it would be a couple hundred per counselor at the early college.
So if it's, I think it's about 250 total at Early College. So it's about 125, I think. Yeah.
I can't do math off
It's
the
okay.
top of my
No,
head
off the top,
anymore.
it's all good. Yeah. So it is a much lower ratio there.
Thank you.
Okay. Were there other questions on the list that we could answer?
Would you like me to just read the questions we have?
Let's start with, let's just go question by question.
Okay. A lot of them we're gonna need to bring back next week.
Okay, so we're either gonna decide we're gonna bring them back next week, or they take enough staff work that we're gonna need the committee to vote on them.
Okay.
Okay.
So the first one is related to transportation costs for OSAA since we switched leagues, and what's the increased cost for busing? And do we have those broken out as a comparison from this year to last year?
Okay. And we answered that one already in where it was in the budget, and we told you where we were on our current expenditure trajectory. More than that would be a hand trip by trip sort for what is over the mountain to OSAA. So that's going to be a question, is that of interest?
And it doesn't need to be exact. I mean, you know, within, you know, $10,000-$20,000 or something, just because I know you might not always go over the mountain, right?
Right.
Sharon?
But if you can extrapolate compared to what we have currently spent compared to last year, and we have how many more months or how many more weeks left? So we could probably do the math here.
So you'd like year-to-date expenditures in that category for this time right now versus last time?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying, I don't think you should go back and have to do a hand-to-hand count.
Yep.
If you just extrapolate to what we have left.
'Kay.
And just an estimate, I
Yep.
think.
Yep. That would be, just a quick estimation around that would be one that we can easily get, and we'll leave it on the list for next week. Okay, next, yes.
I just wanted to make a comment so that everybody doesn't think early college has got it made, you know, in the gravy with their 2 counselors. Those counselors do different work than at a regular high school, I believe, because a lot of those students are also going to Chemeketa, so they're working on different things that other high schools might not be working on.
Okay, next question.
Question number 2, how does the district compare to state averages in overall spending? And how does the district spend its money in comparative categories? So examples like construction, services. That was a question that Adriana forwarded.
We think we might be able to get an answer through a software product called Forecast 5 that OSBA purchases. I don't know if the answer will come back exactly like the questions asked. So let us spend just a little bit of time seeing how we can do some comparisons and see.
I mean, our comparators are really limited.
Yep.
It's us and Beaverton. I mean, that's really where we compare. They're as close. Portland's too big, and then you drop off to North Clackamas and Eugene, and that's a significant drop off in the number of students. So really, our comparator we're going to probably look at is Beaverton. We can probably get that through Forecast 5, but that's going to be your comparator. And remember, they're making way bigger budget cuts than we are this year. So I'm not sure that'll be a real good comparator for us, but we can try to get that information through Forecast 5.
Is it still information that the group wants? Do you want to take it through a vote?
Why don't we see if we can get that information?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
let's work with Angie at OASBO, Angie Peterman, who's the executive director of the Oregon Association of School Business Officials, and see if we can get that information, and we can report back next week on that. It is a proprietary software program that OSBA has entered into a partnership with OASBO for, but I think we should be able to look at a Beaverton comparator and let you know.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, next question.
Okay, question number 3. Where do positions exist that specifically help teachers with modified curriculum for students with disabilities to access gen ed classes and curriculum? That was a question by Cynthia.
Okay. And do you feel like that is a question we can answer, but we can answer fairly quickly before next week, or do you have follow-up questions for Cynthia?
I think that's probably a conversation Cynthia and I can continue to have offline. It's not as much budget implications as it is programmatic implications, and how are we managing the people that we have and getting resources into teachers' classrooms. So I'm willing to continue that.
I still would like to know what the number is, though, like in ratio.
Sure.
Like ratios to the special ed students and, you know, that kind of thing.
So how many,
Curriculum ratios?
no, how many PAs do we have as resources? to-
Program assistants.
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
We can,
Yeah, we can get you program assistant. Yep.
Thank you.
all right, next question. What is the superintendent's salary and benefit structure? That was asked by Director Kylo.
Yep. We can get that.
Okay. Next one. Do we have an updated curriculum adoption that's related to smoking and drug use? And when was the last curriculum adopted related to those topics? And that was Virginia's question.
And so the part of the question that we can answer for next week is when was the last, what's the copyright level of the materials and all that?
Okay. Do we have a priority list of our school improvement fund additions prioritized out kind of in our wish list?
On our school improvement fund additions, the answer will be no. We don't have a prioritized list yet. The one that was top of the list was counselors. I will come back to you with a prioritized list of what we know as our, any increases related to our current budget that we know we're gonna get. The school improvement fund, we're gonna take a little more time with to really be sure we're strategically spending. So I won't have that within the budget cycle for the Student Success Act funds, but any proposed additions, I will. And I just took some of the priority number 1 off the list with the counselors.
All right. Have we gathered community input on the effectiveness of school-based health assistance? Overall, is that funding working, and do people find the funding appropriate? Was that kind of what you were asking?
Yeah. I'm gonna guess that we would say there should be more nurses and more time. So I would, the little bit I have heard is around those elementary, especially school-based health assistants, 2 to 3 hours of time would be better. And remember, we added nurses, and we could actually stand a couple more nurses.
Can I?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Kathleen, on that one, I remember the testimony from last year was mostly from our classified employees who were our office assistants who that job fell to. Was that the group of folks you were looking to get the information from, to see if that, because it was your motion that we all voted to approve to get those into our schools?
Correct.
And it was that testimony that at least turned my mind on that, was from the classified office assistants. Are those the folks you're looking for?
Right, so,
Because I think Rita may be able to help
You
us
know,
with that.
feedback, looking at outcome measures, is that money well spent? Are we seeing some of the desired outcomes? If, where are still the problems,
gaps.
and is it still impacting that staff adversely?
Yeah, and I think we can get that by not doing a wholesale ask, but just pull out a couple of
Specific, sure.
schools. And I know actually our level directors have some of that
Okay,
information.
great, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, the last unanswered one that I have, and then we can see if there's others. And this was Chuck's question. If we looked at the proposed numbers for this year's OBL expenditures compared to last year's OBL expenditures, how do those two numbers kind of broadly compare? Is that correct?
Right. Excuse me, yes, because Linda was talking about X amount of dollars here, there, and everywhere else. And at the board level, we have a lot of testimony from teachers talking about kind of the toxic environment that they've got. And I'd be curious to see kind of, are we increasing our resources in that area to help them, or are we maintaining?
So in general, this proposed budget does not include significant adds to OBL. So as FTE and costs are rolled up, obviously we have escalating costs of personnel, salaries and benefits, but there is not, within the proposed budget, there are not significant adds of staff or programs to OBL from 1819 to 1920.
But it's on the list.
Yeah. On the list for ads, yeah.
And that's the list of questions that I had that weren't answered.
Yeah. Do we have the list from Adriana? She had an entire list.
I haven't.
You haven't seen that? Okay.
I don't believe that any of these are answered tonight.
Okay.
Kinds of questions, but did everybody get a copy of this?
No.
Okay, so Adriana
Yeah, the
asked
comparative
8
one.
questions on here, one of which we already referred to, the comparison between the state average in spending and Salem-Keizer. Additionally, what does the district spending per student look like compared to the state average? How much money does the district get from grants or donations? How many additional dollars come into the school district in that format? What programs are not being fully funded right now? Any? All?
All.
Yeah.
We can add to that one, I suppose. Number 5.
Where do you want me to start?
Yeah, right. What is the degree of autonomy that principals have in deciding how to spend their school budget? When we talk about equity and have a focus on equitable outcomes for our district, how is the superintendent ensuring that principals are making budgetary decisions through an equity lens? How is the superintendent holding principals accountable to ensure they are making budgetary decisions with an equity lens and ensure this is happening across the district? And if there isn't a system in place for this, could we be looking at creating an equity action plan that is aligned with student achievement outcomes? So, great questions, not any I'm going to answer in 10 minutes.
Some of those are not.
And I think maybe it would be helpful to reach out to Adriana and ask her a clarifying question. When you talk about the principal's budget, are you talking about those discretionary dollars that you talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Where it's, elementary has a different amount than high school, so it may be good to clarify with her,
Yes,
because that's really the money that the principal has control over.
exactly. Yeah, they have control over, master schedule, but that's also student-driven
Right.
master schedule. They have some, and then there's a little bit of discretionary with Measure 98 around the student success teams, but we'll clarify that with Adriana.
So, other than Adriana's questions, I didn't hear from staff of really any question that couldn't be, that will require a lot of staff time to bring back, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. We might not be able to answer them exactly as you've asked them, but I don't think any are a lot of staff work. I think a couple of Adriana's we might not be able to answer for next week, or might not be budget questions, and we'll have to decide how we handle those. But I think we can do that next week.
I'm sure we can come up with a few if you want.
What's that?
I said, I'm sure we can come up with a few if you'd like.
That's okay. We're on a good roll right now. So
Thank you for your support.
So, I want to just give, before we move on to the next subject, I just want to make sure there are no other last questions from the committee members or comments. If not, then I think we're ready to start looking at next week's process. So that next meeting is actually scheduled to be the first meeting where we receive public comment.
Correct. Yep.
Could you help me out reminding everybody what that
Yeah,
process
so
would look like?
two things I think will happen next week. We will come forward with changes to the proposed budget. So based on any additional revenue or subtraction of revenue, it's all going to be additional. That's what I'm thinking. So changes to the proposed budget, both in revenue and expenditures. We will also come back to you with answers to questions. And then we will give you a few minutes to ask clarifying questions around those. Then we'll open it up for public comment. So the public will need to sign in when they get here. We will have our interpreters here again next week, and then they'll have 3 minutes for testimony. We'll put you back at the dais next week in the format we had last week so that our public can come to the podium and do their 3 minutes of testimony. And then we will kind of wrap it up at the end after public testimony. So we'll do changes first, answers to questions, public testimony, 3 minutes. If we need to do some side-by-side interpretation of our testimony, I'll work with Levy and Jim to say, should we set a little different time frame for their public testimony in case 3 minutes isn't enough for English and Spanish or whatever language. Questions about process?
Okay, so I believe we've gone through all the agenda tonight. So with that, meeting is adjourned, and thank you for your work.
I assume